Excuse me. Okay, let me grab my pen here. Oops. There we go. All right, so learning objective 3 talks about equivalent units. And again, we are doing this because it's very important to understand our costs when we're manufacturing things. But the example the book starts off with here is very interesting because actually we do have to do this in higher education all the time. We actually have to come out with what we call full-time equivalent students. We actually do have to calculate this unit ourselves. So this is a very fitting example of what we do in higher education, which is a service business, but we still use equivalent units. Most of the book is focused on manufacturing businesses, and so it's good that they stuck this in here. All right, so this is the situation here to understand and your introduction to equivalent units. Let's say you have a work-study job in the office of the president of the college, and she asks you to compute the cost of instruction, so it's the cost of teaching you, per full-time equivalent student, at your college. The vice president of finance tells you that they spend $9 million in the total cost of instruction, okay? Furthermore, the vice president tells you that there are 900 full-time students at the college, and there are 1,000 part-time students at the college, okay? Well, we have to calculate full-time equivalent. So how do we take those part-time students and convert them to full-time equivalent students? Well, that's what this illustration explains that. Part-time students take 60% of the classes of a full-time student, okay? So when we compute the number of full-time equivalent students, we have to add the full-time students, which we know there are 900 full-time students. And basically, we're going to have to add that to the equivalent units of part-time students who can convert, right? So part-time students, there are 1,000 of them, but they only take 60% of the classes of a full-time student load. So basically, a part-time equivalent student would be the 1,000 part-time students times 60% of a full-time load, which is the same as 600, right? So this college has 1,500 full-time equivalent students, okay? Again, that's the full-time students they have, and we converted, basically, part-time students to full-time students. So 1,000 part-time students that are taking 60% of a course load of a full-time student would be the same as having 600 new full-time students. That's the conversion. Okay. So 600 and 900 is the 1,500. Again, the finance vice president said they spent $9 million on instruction. And now we know we have 1,500 full-time equivalent students. So the cost of instruction per student is $6,000. And again, we actually do this in higher ed. I love the fact that they start with that example. Well, let's take a look at a manufacturing example here for for equivalent units of production. They basically use what's called a weighted average method. It's the most widely used method, and it's the only one that's looked at here in this particular book that we're studying. In the appendix, there's more information on using different methods, but we're going to focus on this one. So we look at basically what we need to do is there are units that have been transferred out that are basically done, right? but then there are some units that are still in the process of getting done, right? That work in process. Well, how much of those units are done? And how much still needs to get done? We add those together, the ones that are already done, to the equivalent units in the work in process that we can calculate. And that gets us to what's called an equivalent units of production. So this is important. By the way, this is on page 96, at the bottom of page 96, for those that have the textbook. So let's take a look at how this works for a company. So Corey Company, they have a packaging department that had 10,000 units completed and transferred out. So those are already done. Those are already full and done, complete. But they have another 5,000 units that are in work in process. They're in the process of getting done, which are 70% complete. So these 10,000 units are already complete. And 70% of these 5,000 units are complete. So what is the equivalent units of production? How much is basically done, right? That's the equivalent units. Well, again, those 10,000 units that have been completed and transferred out, we know are done. We also know that 70% of the work has been done on the 5,000 units that are in work in process. So we can convert that into 3,500 more units that have been done. Thus, the total number of equivalent units of production is 13,500 units, okay? So this is one of the most important things that we have to do is to start converting to units. Once we understand how the units are done, then you're going to understand how the costs are calculated. All right, so this particular example is on the top of page 97 in your book, and it talks about a company that's been around for a very, very long time, Kellogg, and they produce Eggo waffles. They have been since 1970, okay? I let go of my Eggo. Has been around for some time, over about 50 years now, right? So when Kellogg produces Eggo, they go through 3 different departments, okay? There's a mixing department, there's a baking department, and then there's a freezing and packaging department, okay? So there are 3 basic units of, work in progress happening to complete the Eggo waffles, okay? Starts in mixing, transfers to baking, and that transfers to freezing packages, and then it's a finished good. So the mixing department combines all the dry ingredients, which is flour, salt, and baking powder, with the liquid ingredients, which is eggs and vegetable oil, and that makes the batter, okay? If you want to look at your book, although it's going to show up on the next screen, illustration 3.9 at the very top of page 97 will show you more information from the mixing department at Kellogg's, okay? So what you have here is Kellogg started with 100,000 units. They started 800,000 units. That's a lot of Eggos. So a total of 900,000 Eggos have been started in production, started with and being produced. Well, what becomes of those Eggos? Well, of the 900,000 total units, 700,000 of those are done and have been transferred to the next department, right, which is the baking department. And 200,000 of those are still in process. Okay, well, of the ones that are in process, you know, what's been happening? Well, 100% of the materials are in this mix, but it's only 60% converted. Conversion costs here are a mix of labor and manufacturing overhead. Okay, and that's That's what you need to know. Materials are just that, raw materials. And so for these 200,000 that are work in process at the end of June, 100% of the materials have been accounted for, but only 60% of the labor and manufacturing overhead are part of this so far. So the question then becomes, right, what's your costs? What's your costs for this? Well, in this case, we actually have to look at cost in two ways, right? Because we're using materials. So there's costs that are going to be allocated from materials, right, to the mixing department and moved forward. And there are conversion costs. Like I said, excuse me, the labor and the manufacturing overhead, right? So there are 700,000 of those AGOs that are done and complete. And so if they're done and complete, all the materials have been used, all the labor and overhead is done because the product is done and transferred out of the mixing department. Okay. But that 200,000 that's left in the work in process is not done. All the materials are accounted for. All the materials are accounted for because you have to mix everything before you have to have all the dry ingredients and wet ingredients before you can mix it. So all the materials have been used up. But in terms of the conversion costs, right, the labor and overhead costs, only 60% are accounted for. So the equivalent units, how many AGOs are actually done? Well, equivalent in terms of just materials, all 900,000 of the 900,000 are accounted for in terms of material. However, when it comes to conversion costs, 60% of those 200,000 are done. And so they can be accounted for, but the other 40% is not done. So you can't really put them into the equivalent units. So the 700,000 are totally done. Of the 200,000, 60% of those are totally done in terms of conversion. And so in terms of conversion costs, 820,000 AGO waffles are accounted for, or equivalent units for conversion. Okay, and again, conversion includes labor and overhead. Okay, labor and overhead. So that's important. And this illustration is at the bottom of page 97. All right, at the top of page 98, they sort of put together the equation that you just used. You used this here, but they're just actually showing you what it would be like. So in terms of materials versus conversion costs, how would you calculate the equivalent unit? Well, in most cases, the materials have to be used up front. And so in almost all cases, all the materials are going to be accounted for equivalent units. But the real issue is about the conversion costs, all the labor and all the overhead that's going to be used. Well, you can't count 100% of that until it's done. So here is where you're going to get an equivalent unit for whatever it needs to get done, right? And that's really where the key is it's not going to be in materials so much as it's going to be in the conversion costs that you're going to be looking at. Okay, so here is a question. The mixing department's output consists of 20,000 units completed and transferred out. So those 20,000 units, you can assume, literally, has all of the materials and all of the conversion costs, labor and overhead, as part of them. So they're all done. And there's 5,000 units at ending work in process. That's 60% complete as to materials and conversion costs. Okay. Beginning inventory is 1,000. Excuse me. And 40% of that beginning inventory is complete as to materials and conversion costs. So what are the equivalent units of production here? Okay, well, again, all 20,000 of these are completed, Of the 5,000 units that are in work in process, 60% is completed. Right, so now you got 3,000 of those, right? Because 5,000 units at 60% complete would be 3,000. So now we're up to 23,000. One of the questions then becomes, what do you do with the beginning inventory? Is beginning inventory counted in all of that? So let me go back to a note that's given here. The beginning work in process is not part of the formula. Okay. And so that might help us a lot in understanding whether we even count this 1,000. Okay. And what do you think? If you said we don't, you're right. So it's important to understand that the correct answer here is B. The units completed and transferred out are obviously part of the equivalent units of production. And when you take 5,000 units that are 60% complete, it's the same as 3,000 equivalent units. Okay. We don't include any beginning inventory. So this information is part of the problem, but it's not part of the solution. Okay, here's a do it exercise that is in your book on page 98, if you're looking on. And here we have a company, Outdoor Essentials, and their fabricating department, okay? They have production cost and cost data for the month. Beginning work in process, 0. Woo! Okay, well, that's going to be easy. Can't get confused with the 0. Units that have been transferred out. So these are completed and transferred out. All of these units are going to be counted toward units of production. Right. Ending work in process, right, 10,000. So this is where we have to do a little bit more conversion, right? Because how much of that includes materials? How much of that includes conversion costs? Well, the ones that are already completed and transferred out have 100% of the costs, okay? So in terms of this, materials are entered at the beginning of the process, so all the materials are there. And in terms of the ending work in process units, 30% complete regarding conversion. So they've only kind of just begun here, 30% complete. So what's the equivalent units of production for materials? Well, for materials, all the materials have been used because you have to start with those materials, they say. They're entered at the beginning of the process. So all 15,000 of these have all the materials that they will have. And guess what? All 10,000 of these have all the materials they will have. So what's the equivalent units of production for materials? 15,000 plus 10,000. So it's going to be a total of 25,000 equivalent units. Sorry for my little zeros there. My comma didn't come out. So in terms of material units, everything is included. So all 25,000 are equivalent units. That's not true for conversion costs, right? Because it says that only 30% of the conversion costs are accounted for in the work in process number. So of these 10,000 units, they're only 30% complete regarding conversion, right? if they're transferred out, they're completed, everything is there. So for conversion costs, all 15,000 of the units that have been transferred out have conversion costs in them. But we're going to only add 30% of that number, which is 3,000, right? So in terms of equivalent units for conversion costs, 15,000 plus the 3,000 will give you 18,000 here. I think oh, it's actually given to you right here. Ooh, check it out. Okay, so for materials, all of the units transferred out have the materials. All of the ending work in process have the materials. So you're simply adding those two together. But for conversion costs, only a part of the work in process inventory is done. What part of it is done? 30% of it. So that means an equivalent 3,000 units, and that's how you get the 18,000. All right, so I'm going to stop, bring us back to our main screen for questions.